So good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Here we are again at World War II TV panel discussion, and we're going to be talking tank aces today, which is a topic that is sure to get people excited. And joining me are Paul, Richard, and Sophie, who you know who they are from the YouTube description. Don't need to explain who they are. And I want to talk about the reason for this discussion, essentially. And I've been a tour guide in Normandy, France for a long time, nearly 2 decades now. And Paul's been a tour guide a long time. And probably the grave we get asked to visit the most on tours, beyond Allied graves, not the Nyland brothers, not Teddy Roosevelt Jr., is Michael Wittmann. I don't say Richard, Michael Wittmann at Lacombe. And time again, we take people over to his grave. And I want the question answered. Why is this interest with the German tank aces so compelling? Where does it come from? Why do people get obsessed about the Germans and their hardware and their results? And so I brought 3 people on to discuss it. So good evening, folks. Are you looking forward to this?
Yes. Good evening.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Paul.
Yeah. So let's start with the words tank, or the words tank ace, because that's what I labeled the show, and there's numerous books on Amazon referring to Panzer Aces and tank aces. It isn't a term that appears to have started it in World War II. It's a post-war term, isn't it? I'll bring you in, Paul, first, because you're kind of our World War II guy. So in the war, the Germans weren't really recording individual tallies, were they?
No, not certainly not early war, and it was something that that really began, I believe, as mostly as propaganda. As the war began to turn against the Germans, and of course by 43 they'd also developed much better tanks, or certainly much better tank guns, sighting systems. So the actual tank casualties began to go up, but I think the war was turning against Germany, and it became very much a propaganda issue. And certainly with some of the so-called tank aces, the Panzer Aces, the previously mentioned Wittmann became very much a poster boy of the propaganda ministry. A lot of that actually had to do with the promotion of almost superstars, the celebrities of the day, and the promulgation of the Nazi Party, pushing particularly Waffen SS commanders, pushing the equipment, the Tiger tanks, the Panther tank, that obviously, although the war was going against the Germans, they actually wanted to make it look as though particularly the stalwarts of the Nazi Party, obviously parts of the SS, the Waffen SS, and the Panther Truppe themselves, were actually having large-scale success against whoever the enemy was on any front. And I think that's how it began to get into this, where bean counting and kill counting became part of the actual award system. But if you interview German veterans, which luckily over the years, I'll not bore everybody with a story of how it all came about, but actually came out from a visit to Stalingrad in 2001, where I actually met some German veterans at the cemetery at Ruchowska, particularly from Jagdgeschwader Unit and the 29th Motorized Infantry Division, the Falke Division. And that led on to me getting contact over the years with a number of German veterans, including Waffen SS and Panzer veterans. What that led to was, if I get time later on, I can maybe relay some of the actual interviews. Some didn't want to talk a great deal. Some wanted to talk a lot, particularly a guy called Hans Siegel, who was a Normandy Knights Cross winner with the Hitler Jugend division, but who served with the Leibstandarte from the very early days, 1939. People like Siegel, who, if you look on the internet, on the Panzer Ace and Panzer Kill count lists, he features on there. But the bottom line is Siegel had no idea how many tanks he'd knocked out between 1939 and 1945 when he was seriously wounded in Hungary and lost his arm. And he fought
sorry to interrupt you, but
Sturmgeschütz and Panzer IVs.
because the model seems to come from the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine with the
Yes.
pilots, the Battle of Britain pilots, and then later the U-boats, because
That's
they
right.
both did take scores, didn't they? That the Luftwaffe always did record, well, as did the Royal Air Force and everybody else. They always did record their tallies, and so did the U-boats. That was all part of their tonnage of what. So it seems to me that as the Germans start losing the air war, and perhaps they start losing the Battle of the Atlantic, the tanks become the obvious new replacement for that in the press. Is that, I'll bring Richard and Sophie in now, because it seems only fair. I'll bring Richard in first. Is that how you think of it? You know, that it comes in kind of be the new sexy thing in terms of the German propaganda machine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we obviously had Goebbels, you know, the mastermind of propaganda, who was leading the whole thing. And like you say, with any tank warfare, it's very with tank warfare, it's very hard to define a kill anyway. It's not quite as clear as, you know, the Luftwaffe. You shoot one, it spirals down and, you know, crashes. Very hard with tank warfare. So we had Goebbels and his propaganda machine, you know, throughout the period. And of course, much like, you know, we also, I mean, the Allies also needed something. We needed propaganda as well. It's all every conflict is a propaganda war. It all boils down to very similar things. The Germans were just superior to everybody else at doing it. You know, we had on our side that Montgomery, rather jealous of Rommel's fame and, you know, his goggles that he wore, and Monty wanting to be very similar to that as well. So, yeah, I do think it's where it's boiled about that. And don't forget, of course, that, you know, as far as we'll probably talk about, you know, the technology and that later on in this discussion, but also, you know, we had the mighty German armor, which was, you know, it was superior in many respects. It was poor in many respects. It was logistically, you know, bad. We had the many conflicts that were going through. So everybody needs a hero. You know, the British Army today needs a hero. You need somebody you can look up to. And I think by doing this, we actually made this, you know, initially during the war, the tank was, you know, it was a dirty way of fighting. It wasn't as clean cut. It wasn't the Red Baron-esque of the airways. You know, we had nothing similar. So I think that's where it all came about, really. And as I said, you know, throughout this whole period, my interest has always been in the people as much as the machinery. So, you know, a fascinating subject. But you're quite right, Paul, in what you're saying, yes.
Well, I think we're time to bring in Sophie now as well. And you know, I was reading in my research for this some quotes by Steve Zaloga, who's written a lot about armor. I know Steve a little bit, and he was saying as well that some of this idea of tank aces is, I quote, romantic nonsense, and most of the successful tank commanders were indeed bushwhackers, meaning it was kind of hit and run and ambush, and it wasn't this idea of this almost medieval kind of jousting of tank commanders going, you know, mano a mano in some sort of field of arena is simply not the case, although it kind of is that case a little bit in the gaming. I kind of understand the gaming world takes it a little bit more into a sort of jousting, but I'll bring Sophie in now because it's your turn, frankly. So, you know, what's your take on where it all started, this hero worship of the Germans?
I think, like, when you talk about hero worship and kind of focusing on a central or singular figure with things, we do that in history anyway. That's kind of how we teach. We'll take like one or two figures. You got Cleopatra, you mentioned Churchill and Monty, when you start to look at these like sort of central figures to explain an entire story. But when it comes around to like fanboyism and aces, I mean, we do that with sports. We do that with musicians. Who's got the most top 10s on the Watsons and the number ones on the Billboard, whatever's, you know, that's kind of how we tend to focus with achievements. We want to sort of quantify it, right? Like, who's got the most of such is easier to say, well, LeBron ain't got 6 rings. You know, you want to kind of quantify competence. That's sort of how we look at it, and even from a pop culture standpoint. So to me, it sort of makes sense, especially as time moves forward. The farther and farther we get away from World War II, the less people that we have to tell their stories in their own voices, the more and more of these other sort of things, other biases can come in, whether it's from people who want to sell books or get YouTube views, or from the entire like Hollywood movie and media machine, which is what it is kind of in its own thing. And that's been, I mean, they made movies about World War II during World War II. Look at Five Graves to Cairo. Rommel was in that before the war even ended from Hollywood. So we've been having this romanticization of World War II specifically, like since World War II, and I think it'll probably just kind of continue. And it's up to historians, sort of like yourself, to get in there and put forward what you can find from the correct sources to sort of block out the rest of sort of this.
That's interesting that you brought in the word historian now, because you know, I'm doing some research. We spoke, some of us, last night in the test for this, and the thing is, the historian has a very small voice now. That's one of the reasons why I brought two people on. Richard, you from Two Worlds, driving real tanks, and now planning pixelated tanks, I guess is the word. But you know, you're from you've driven the real ones, and now you play with the on-screen ones. So you have more influence. Gamers have more influence on the world than historians do. That's the reality, as do movies. And Sophie wanted to bring that point up, and we'll discuss that later. Movies like Fury do more to make people learn about tank tactics. And I'm using the word learn in its loosest sense, given that Fury is not the best example of, although my partner Mag did like
really,
it when
Paul,
Brad Pitt
really
took his shirt off. Anyway, whatever. But the point is, the movies and video games have a huge influence that historians don't. I mean, a good pen and sword contract for a book is a few hundred copies, isn't it? And they take a year or two to sell. Just before I bring other people in, I just did some work on Amazon today, just looking and searching terms. If you search for the word Panzer on Amazon, there are 6,000 hits come up. If you search for Tiger tank, there are 800 hits. Sherman gets 400 hits. Panther gets 600 hits. There are 6 different books on Wittmann, 3 on Knispel, numerous editions of Otto Carius's book, 3 volumes of Panzer Aces. There's the Panzer Grenadier Aces, SS Panzer Voices, blah, 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 blah. To give an example of how they sell differently, Tank Action and Armored Troop Commanders War, David Render is 35,000 somewhere on the Amazon list. The Van Rosen book, Panzer Ace, The Memoirs of an Iron Cross Panzer Commander, is 12,000 on list, so 3 times higher. The Hans von Luck books, of which there have been numerous editions, if you add them all together, that comes out really high as well. So history, the German history seems to be outselling the Allied history in terms of armor, which I think is interesting. We'll touch on that as the show goes on. Just addressing the questions we're coming on YouTube. And again, thanks for those watching us. We will try and bring you in. That's part of why we do it live, to bring you in. Dave Collins, who's one of my friends, a Civil War buff, is saying, will you be, and the panel be discussing the tactics of a Panzer versus a Sherman tank, for example, in the philosophy of why the tanks were built the way they were? Yes and no. We're not going to go too much in the technical side of things, because it kind of gets into the, you know, the top trumps kind of thing. But I think we will touch the tactics. I think that's something we really want to bring in Richard and Paul as well. Did the tactics the Allies approach lend themselves to German commanders getting a higher tally than Allied commanders? That we'll touch on that later on. So, well, we've kind of laid out our rules of engagement, so to speak. We've kind of brought the subject off to a start. So, the question now is to, you know, elaborate on that World War II thing. So the propaganda thing is obviously key there. And Sophie, I liked your points about well, let's talk about a little bit about the, and I don't want to use the word sexiness of the German uniforms, but kind of the whole appearance, the whole mystique of German tankers starts very much in World War II itself, with the way the Germans developed the uniforms, everything. I mean, share some of your thoughts on that, if you may, please.
I guess so. Looking at, so you mentioned before, like the propaganda machine, right? We have Signal magazine, we have Die Wehrmacht magazine. So you have military publications to appeal to both occupied and Axis, as well as any Allied forces that might get a hold of it, that sort of promotes the fighting forces of Nazi Germany at the time. And you look at, say, you mentioned like the uniforms, it all kind of comes together in a package of like, okay, so material aesthetic, right? Obviously, so we have a government which espouses eugenics as like a way to build a society. And so how you look and how you appear has to do with your values. So you see it a little bit with, Leni Riefenstahl's films about with the Olympics, and you see the statues of the bodies, and so the soldier, the ultimate soldier, right? So you have our Panzer uniform, everything, it looks quite tailored. You know, the back of the jacket is shorter than the front to make the soldier's legs look longer. It's high cut compared to if you look at other like sort of military tunics around that time. So you have this high focus on aesthetic and this ideal, which I think just kind of goes along with the rest of sort of what Nazi Germany was trying to promote at the time as an ideal, not just for citizenry, but obviously for its own fighting forces. And one of the things that I hear like a lot, right, is like, oh, well, of course, Nazi uniforms look good because Hugo Boss made them, but Hugo Boss did not design them. Hugo Boss as a fashion house did not design the Nazi uniforms. You think of a fashion house like Hugo Boss, like they have now, like on the runway, you draw out the design and then you manufacture them, but that's not quite how it works. Perhaps some of his factories did produce them like they did with other like postal uniforms and stuff at the time. But people just say this. People just say stuff because it sounds cool. And then other people, oh, okay, well, that seems to have a little bit of truth. You know, Hugo Boss is a German fashion house and it was around at that time. And this seems reasonable to assume that Hugo Boss made the Nazi uniforms and that's why they look good. But Hugo Boss did not design the Nazi uniforms. You know, those were two other people, which are found by very easily Googling things. And I think part of the problems that you see kind of going back from what we discussed before about like the aces and these numbers that get thrown around is that data evaluation from it's a personal responsibility to understand that not everything that you read on the internet is true. And even not everything that you read in a history book is true. What are the sources of these things that are being claimed? If you're on a Facebook group, which can act very much as a giant echo chamber of people who all like the same thing and repeat the same stuff, the amount of times that I've seen just on Twitter and on Facebook about, for example, the Hugo Boss thing, which is, it has enough truth in it because, you know, Hugo Boss was an ardent Nazi at the time, part of the party and stuff like that. There's just enough truth kind of for it to stick. But if you bothered to Google it and dig around just a little bit, you'd sort of find you'd sort of find what the real truth is. So I think people need to be careful about what they hear. But again, if it sounds cool, people will share it before they evaluate it for themselves.
Well, I feel that if people bother to Google it, it's going to become a bit of a mantra during this show, because I think that's going to be a lot. You know, one of the things that is a factor is that this obsession with the German tank aces, and I don't like using the word, but that's what I label the show. That's what we're going to call it. If people just Googled stuff and actually read the papers, they would find out that a lot of the stuff they think isn't true anyway. So that's but the coolness, I think, is interesting. So Richard, let's bring you in as a former tanker. When you were, you know, however old you were when you joined the RTR, even
16, Paul. 16.
I mean, even when you were in that era, was there amongst your fellow recruits some kind of anything mystique about the German army? Did people kind of talk about Tiger tanks, or was it just not anything that people discussed at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the whole thing is about the personification of evil. Let's face it. I mean, you've got Adolf Hitler, who pre-war, we had to make him appear as the arch enemy, which, of course, to every degree he was. And post-war, then, like Sophie said, we had all the social media side of it, the films, Hollywood, and everything else as well. But certainly when I joined the army, I mean, everybody was. If you ask anybody, I mean, my wife is a prime example. If you ask her, she has no interest whatsoever in history or armored warfare or tanks, funnily enough. She's very much into horses. But if you ask her to name a tank, have a guess what she would say. It'll be a Tiger tank, of course, because that's what everybody knows. And my fascination from a personal level grew from the mechanics and that side of it, as opposed to anything else. It also happened to be that at that particular time in my life, I actually grew up in a little village called Villers-Bocage, which is about 15-minute drive away from the Tank Museum in Bovington. So I had all of that even when I was a very young child, that sort of, you know, that impact and that feel around armored warfare. And certainly when we joined, everybody, I mean, I would safe to say in basic training that your general soldier in the tank regiment could name by far more German pieces of armor than they could the English or anybody else. That's very safe to say. And we had to do, obviously in training, you do things like you have to do essays about certain characters from the war, certain vehicle types, manufacture and that. And 9 times out of 10, everybody would choose, you know, a piece of German armor because it was that whole emphasis of evil. You know, it was pure evil. The Tiger tank was pure evil. And of course, like you turn on the telly at any stage, what sells really well on TV, it's things about serial killers. It's, you know, it's the nasty side. It's human nature. People like to see things which are pretty grotesque. Horror films do incredibly well. And this was a really, really terrible time of history. But again, I think it's important that we talk about it. And like going back to what you said about historians, it's very hard. Interestingly enough, I had only a couple of weeks ago a very lengthy interview with, I can't say who it was, but it was the Australian press, all around the subject of the gaming industry, history, and do we do it justice, and other games that perhaps a bit more gratuitous than things like World of Tanks, blah, blah, blah. But it was a very interesting, about 3-hour interview about where I sit as a former, you know, tank commander, veteran, and going into this industry, which, let's face it, makes a living. Makes revenue about that, and they're doing it justice. So this is why, you know, as a prime example, as a company, we get heavily involved with restoration of vehicles and things because we feel it's our right to hand back. But yeah, the history is very confusing. You talk to 100 historians, all of them will disagree, which is great, of course. War records, of course, were very hard. We talk about the kill ratio. I mean, I've probably seen a dozen different, figures quoted for how many kills Wittmann actually had, amplified, I'm sure, because going back to the propaganda again. But an interesting topic, and of course, amongst historians, everybody likes to feel they're right all of the time. But it's just a fascinating subject anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm keeping an eye on the YouTube comments. Nick Budd is making the point, of course, that in addition to the aesthetic look of the German Panzer uniform, there's also the practicality of them being black for oil, hence the Royal Tank Regiment black berets. But I think you have to look at the cut and the dash of the German uniforms, take that oil concealing practicality to a really kind of extra level than the baggy old denim overalls the British tank crews wore in World War II. So the Germans, I think we can't just say it's exclusively for practicality. There's definitely a dash and a cut and where these terms like the knights and the Black Baron to describe Wittmann, where did that come from? Is that a wartime term? Is that a post?
No, that was totally made up. So, post-war, yeah.
We'll thrash these things out. I think before we get into more into the psychology of why the obsession, I think I want to still go back to this World War II thing. So it's World War II TV. So the tactical approach, because all three of you can give input on this. Was the German system in any way, when they discover the success of the propaganda and they start getting these heroes in the press and people like Wittmann and even people like Kurt Meyer and others start becoming well known back home, do German tactics change to allow some of these I'm going to use the word aces again, to get their increased tally? Because we know that happened with the Luftwaffe, didn't we? We know that people like Galland were being sent up, these young kids who would be shot down so Galland could go mop up the leftovers and get his kill ratio up. Did that happen with tanks? Does anyone know the answer to that, Paul or Richard or Sophie?
Well, I would say not specifically for the actual the promulgation, obviously the tank aces with the public through the obviously the Wochenschau, the weekly reports, similar to our Pathé News. In some ways, Paul, I think that the actual development of the German tank tactic was a result of what the opposition, what the Allies were actually doing against them, particularly if you look what happened in Russia. And the development of what became known as the Germans, excuse me, to the pack fronts, where the Russians, if you look at 1941 and just discussing some of those early battles of 1941, the great uncertain battles, the Battle of Brody, which some would argue was potentially one of the largest tank battles in history, or the largest tank battles in history. At that point, the Russians were throwing tanks into battle, no communications, little tactical notes, and obviously they were just being swallowed up by the Blitzkrieg, and that basically battle group, tanks, artillery, the Stukas, the actual air support, and the Russians, without a shadow of a doubt, lost thousands and thousands of tanks. You reverse that through, one of the areas I've studied quite, because I do tours to Stalingrad, I've studied the fighting in the Great Don Bend, which is not an area that particularly people who are interested in tanks and tank warfare actually study. But there was a huge tank battle in the Great Don Bend in July or into August 1942 between obviously elements of the 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, and numerous Russian tank armies, the 1st and 4th Tank Army in particular. And what my study of that is, the 6th Army claimed 1,000 tanks knocked out during that battle. Now that doesn't correlate exactly to the amount of Russian tanks that were lost, but certainly the Russians did lose hundreds and hundreds of tanks. But what I always found interesting about that, if you look at the so-called aces and the actual kill counts, that's a subject that needs discussed on its own, actually, how you measure a kill.
Well, indeed.
There was very few Knight's Crosses actually awarded to panzer troops during the battle in the Great Don Bend. In fact, I'm talking 5 or 6. Most of them were actually for command of troops. So what I think is that basically at that time of the war, this sort of pin counting, this number counting didn't actually exist other than for single engagements where a single tank commander or a platoon or a company battalion would actually engage, and obviously through good leadership, valor in action, some people will be awarded the Knight's Cross. That I think changed in 1943 because the Germans began to change their tactics, particularly after the summer battles of 1943, with the establishment of the in-depth defences, particularly at Kursk, where the Germans began to lose a lot of tanks against the Russian anti-tank guns. The Russians had improved their anti-tank gun capability hugely. It improved the tactical nous hugely. And things began to change from then on, Paul. And I think that's when the actual bin counting towards high awards actually came more to the fore, as we spoke about. If you go into 1940, if you have to look at a lot of the tank Knight's Cross winners from the so-called tank aces, a lot of them, the Knight's Cross was awarded from 44 onwards up to the end of the war.
That's really
but there's certainly been that changing.
Yeah.
I mean, one example, I'll just briefly, is that if you look at the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge, Kampfgruppe Piper, the main armoured thrust of the 1st SS Panzer Division, and alongside that, another battle group from the Hitler-Jugend Division, part of the 6th Panzer Army. It wasn't the tanks anymore. I mean, that had something to do with the actual terrain itself, but it wasn't the tanks that did the break-in. The Germans had changed tactics where the infantry would do the break-in into the enemy positions to try and take out the anti-tank threat before the panzers were actually sent in then. So whether that, I've got no knowledge that was actually to make the actual Panzer Aces look better, but as part of the propaganda process, but certainly there was that definite change in tactics. But I think it was probably brought about more about the tactics. Normandy, Paul, as you're more than aware, the terrain affected the German tactics.
Yeah, of course.
They couldn't utilise their advantages of the power of particularly the 75 and 88mm guns. So, tactically, apart from a few well-known incidents that have been looked at and investigated, and again referring back to Herr Wittmann and Villers-Bocage, we didn't want to talk about him too much, but he is the classic example of overclaimed kills. Which
let's touch on Villers-Bocage for a minute. I mean, to me, that's always an exception. I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen. Of course it happened. But it's like looking at a freak result in the middle of a season of, if we're talking football, that's a freak result. That's a 6-0 defeat against a run of 5-0 victories. It doesn't sit. And also when you compare what happened the next day, it all evens itself out fairly well anyway. It's not the complete victory, but But I want to bring in Richard and Sophie as well. Richard, particularly because you said it, I think is a very pertinent point, is about how difficult it is to quantify what is a tank hit. And one of the examples I'm going to give before I bring you in is the Battle of Bloody Gulch, June the 13th in Normandy, when the 101st Airborne, the 29th Division, are counterattacked against 17th SS elements of the Fallschirmjäger. And you read the reports of the 101st Airborne, and they're claiming they knocked out, 15 vehicles here, 29th claimed 15 vehicles there, another 10 down the road there. The 17th SS lost about 7 vehicles in the whole day. What was happening is they were being counted multiple times because they'd get hit with someone would throw a grenade at it first, then they'd see it there, then someone would put a shot in it from a Sherman, then another Sherman would come around the corner 20 minutes later, see a tank hull there, not know it's been knocked out, put another shot through it, and so on and so forth. So these same hulls get counted 17 times or something. So Richard, as the tanker here, just explain how really difficult it is in the middle of a battlefield, looking through your periscopes and what have you, and your how difficult it is to actually understand what the hell's going on.
So to give you an idea, that I mean, obviously the fundamentals of serving in a tank have not changed much since. I'll ignore probably World War I because that was very different with the size of the crew and everything. But certainly from then on, you're inside this metal container whether it's usually a crew of 4. And as far as the commander is concerned, so you have your optics in front of you. You know, even with modern optics nowadays, we've got thermal imaging and all the rest of it. But even so, it is a very, very, very low field of view that you've got. And of course, during combat, you're closed down anyway. So as any tanky, it is incredibly hard to see. Put on top of that, of course, that's not the only thing you're doing. You're not only trying to identify potential enemy targets, you're also map reading. So you need to have situational awareness. You need to know where you are all of the time on the battlefield. So you're doing all of this. And of course, at one stage during this, you may be traveling cross country. The hull of the vehicle may be going in one direction. The turret may be pointing somewhere else. And more modern vehicles, you've got independent commanders' capabilities. So the commander could theoretically be pointing in a third direction. Put on top of that, also the fact, of course, you're also issuing fire orders to the gunner. You're also discussing with the loader the nature of ammunition. You're also, and don't forget, of course, most of these people were in positions of command. So they'd also be talking on the radio about the bigger, larger picture, the tactical scenario, what's going on at the moment. So there is an awful lot going on inside of the turret of a tank at one time. So I defy anybody to say that if they fired the one round, I mean, who was counting that round? You know, it was, to be perfectly frank, you know, it goes back to the propaganda. I don't see how, in many cases, it's particularly possible. And tank tactics is all about, it's not a solitary thing, it's all about working as a team, which is why the Germans were very good. I mean, we haven't mentioned training at all, but of course, in particular, the Tiger I crews were very well trained crews. And like anything to do in the army, the better you are at training, the better you become as a crewman on board that vehicle. And it's a big thing in the armed forces. It's all about an automatic reaction to a familiar fire order. So if somebody says to you, you know, DST tank on, everybody, you don't even think about it. The loader knows that he's going to hit the safety switch to safe. He's going to pick up a DST round. He's going to complete the loading sequence. The commander is going to lay the gunner onto the target, hand over that, and he's going to be scanning for other things. But it's all automatic reaction. So there is an awful lot going on. And even to the stage of when you fire that first round, then when you fire a round from a tank, you get a lot of what they call the consequences of firing. So you get platform rock, the actual the tank itself. You get the shimmer, obviously, from the explosives going off, the blast in front of you, the cloud of smoke. It's incredibly hard to identify what is a kill and what isn't a kill. And even when we were carrying out engagements in Iraq, I mean, of course, we're talking at night over thermal imaging many kilometers away with depleted uranium rounds, which, to be fair, is quite easy to know when you hit a target because it goes about 50 foot into the air and bursts into flames. But then, of course, we're talking in this period very hard to identify, which is why you saw so many times a round would be fired, then you'd probably fire another round. At this time, of course, you've also got your other tanks they're engaging as well. So how do you determine which one of those particular tanks is you know, given that kill hit, for want of a much better terminology on there? And of course, on top of all of that, you're also scanning for other vehicles all the time. So you're not only concentrated and blinking on that. Your driver would have been trying to identify other vehicles. He's also looking for a positioning. Tank warfare is all about positioning. Every single critical thing about it, to always present the fronts, the biggest part of the armor of a tank, towards the enemy, to actually get it, you know, as much dead ground as you possibly can, but still enable all of the optics and everything to be used. So there's an awful lot going on. So I do think it would have been incredibly, almost impossible at stages to say, yes, I am the person that's responsible for the kill on that tank.
And probably even from your era, more hazards in World War II to get you than when your era, because of the handheld stuff. I mean, the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschrecks and Molotov cocktails and landmines and obstacles you can't get over. There's multiple ways of inhibiting a tank. As Alan King, who I interviewed, the Sherman veteran, of the 3 Shermans he lost, one was the friendly fire, one was I forget, but none were actually to enemy action from another tank. They were all just the shit that happens on the battlefield. So I think, you know, we can address the fact that maintaining score. I've not fired a weapon. I've been inside tanks, I've driven tanks, but I would imagine that once you've engaged a target and you've fired a round at it, you don't want to be sitting there watching for the result. You want to be moving. Surely you don't want to. It's not like a firework where you're waiting for the result to go ooh when the said vehicle you've shot at blows up. You're moving. So yeah, I think the whole target thing and who got what is very, very complicated and impossible to understand. So so tactics. So you haven't talked for a while. So you know, you you are a prolific gamer, and we'll talk to Richard and yourself about the how a modern game incorporates real, genuine tank tactics and what have you. So, you know, the idea of going solo, one tank against another tank, it didn't really happen much in World War II. In fact, one of our Canadian historians, Sheldrake, who watches all my shows, he says less than 10% of engagements from World War II from the Canadian Army, I think he's referring to, are tank on tank. So it's a rare type of battle in World War II. Would you agree?
I think with regards to games and kind of, you start to like lose the big picture with games. Like it's really important to have, you know, perspective like Mr. Cutland of having been there and done that in the tank, because with games, you lose this completely. The large tank titles, like you have War Thunder and you have World of Tanks, which are kind of your biggest titles of like tank versus tank. And fans of both of these games like to bicker endlessly about like realism. Oh, but play War Thunder, it's more realistic. And I'm like, cool, what's real about this? It's a video game. And so when you're playing either of those games, nothing that you're doing really, if you want to look at what Mr. Cutland just talked about, the things that you're paying attention to as commander and his crew and the things that you see, it's not at all like these video games. And as well, tank versus tank, like early on, you see the Panzer III, the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV, it's infantry support. Really look at the early Sherman guns. Like we're kind of thinking with fighting, you got machine gun nests, you have like bunker things, and how are these machines used? Not really necessarily tank versus tank as though they're gonna like square up and duel, you know? You start to, with the video games, you start to get an ultra focus on like the hard statistics of both, as though it's like 1v1 and the crew are all the same and it's sort of this clean, but there's so much going on and there's multiple people. It's not just, you know, when you're playing World of Tanks, for example, or War Thunder, it's just you. You're coordinating yourself with other people on your team if you choose to do so. You don't have to. You can get on voice with some of your friends and play, but it's just you in the tank, right? So you get to be gunner and you're looking at, you have a map all the time that's updated as to where the enemies are. And that's not at all realistic, you know? So I think that it does give people a little bit of a false idea that tank warfare is just tank versus tank. That's all that you're worried about is other tanks, right? But as you mentioned, there's mines, there's these like RPGs and things like that. And of course, nowadays we have our tow missiles and stuff. There's all sorts of hazards for tanks. But in these video games, you don't necessarily see that. The hazard are the other vehicles, the other tanks. And I think that can be, it ends up being extra polarizing. So when you're looking at World War II, you have to be looking at the big picture. You can't just think of the tanks relative to tanks, relative to the enemy's tanks, and kind of their own paper features versus the opposite side's tanks' paper features, which is something I think that video games tend to promote. In the amateur person who gets, because not everybody that plays these games is interested in history, right? So I'm going to assume that people who are paying attention and trying to use World War II games as a way to learn, because it's not going to teach you. If you go into a video game expecting to learn, that's kind of your fault. Like you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Because these games are games. They're supposed to give you a certain experience. You want the real experience, then go head out to the recruiter's office down the street, right? The video games aren't going to give you the experience. And when you go to learn something off of either a film, we talk about games, but films, it's the same way. It's
bringing films shortly.
Yeah, film will provide you a certain experience, but it's not going to be the experience, but it's supposed to give a viewer experience.
We're all shaped by our experiences when we're young, aren't we? So when I went into this, I did this show, I don't play video games, so I've had a look at them for research for the purposes for the show, but I think about how I got into it, and it was war films on a Saturday afternoon. It was Commando and Battle Library comics, Codename Warlord, that kind of thing. But no, even though I know now they were less than accurate, they shaped my whole way my brain works. And that's why I'm interested in the video gaming side, because some of the kids, I know it's not just kids, there's all sorts of ages playing, but some of the people whose first look at World War II is through a video screen, that will be the thing that they'll always look back on as the thing that started an interest. If they go on to read history and I don't know, make documentaries or join the military or something, that first experience of playing a video game will be their first thing. But as we addressed, and we'll go back on it, what video gaming didn't start this whole tank ace obsession. That goes back way earlier, and we're going to have to. It's going to come up sooner or later. So let's do it. Kelly's Heroes. Let's
so
let's
you talk
bring
about
up
like
Kelly's Heroes.
Like you mentioned
twice in the YouTube comments. So you know.
Yeah. You mentioned that you don't play games. You know, I run into online.
I played one called Liberators. I played
Okay.
that for about 6 months for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I would urge the person that doesn't play video games and wants to look at them critically as being like like misleading or something like that. I think it's the same as film. It's a movie you can play, okay? It's like it's entertainment, but your aspect it's just a little different. You have a control, right? Compared to sitting in a seat, you have some control in your hands. It's meant for entertainment. There's these are video games are for kids. This is juvenile. This is silly. This is ridiculous. If you haven't looked at video games for a while, I'm not going to say that you're old, but if you don't keep up with it and your last recollection of a video game might have been something off of Atari, go ahead and look and see what video games are like these days so you can see what people are doing. It's not that different than movies, except they are playing a character through it instead of just watching other people play it. So you talk about things that shaped World War II, right? These things you might not learn, what really happened through a movie, but it'll give you a spark. You're fascinated by this experience that you're seeing on the screen. You want to know more, right? It's evocative. So you go and you study it, whether it's through a comic or through a film. And that's how people, before video games, people learned that this is really interesting and that they ought to know more through film, just as they do through video games. Well, Kelly's Heroes is always quoted as like, that's my favorite tank movie. Yeah. Now, if you ask the question, what's the best tank movie, for like, what's the most accurate tank movie? Kelly's Heroes is not on that list, but it's always everyone's favorite. Divided.
God's armor.
Yeah, it's like that was, and then you talk about like what is the message, what is the experience that these are conveying? What does Kelly's Hero tell about the tiger, the legend of the tiger, right? Like, I ain't locking horns with no tiger, you know what I mean? So like that gives you the idea about the German fighting forces way before video games came out on the scene. So this idea of like, it talks about the personification of evil and kind of building these legends as well as
I found out this recently, it's apropos of nothing, but the sound of the rotating tiger turret in Kelly's Heroes was also the sound of the elevator in Alien, the first one, Sigourney Weaver, the first one. Because they thought that sound had exactly this eerie pitch. They changed the pitch of it, but apparently musically it's a flat note. It gives across evil somehow. That's what I was like, really? You're reading a lot into, but no, because it's got a musical note that has a musical note and it says a message. It says evil and the sophistication. We're on Kelly's Heroes now, so Oddball gives the impression that the Sherman tank is hopeless and it fires paint and they put a plastic pipe on it, and yet the Tiger tank, you hear it go the sound and it feels better, it feels more sophisticated, and that must have started part of this obsession with the Tiger Aces, because it is interesting as well that it's not just tank aces. The ones we talk about seem to be the Tiger Aces as well, don't they? It seems to go hand in hand. It's tigers and it's tank aces. So I think we're getting into the point where we should start discussing where this whole thing came from. We can go back and talk about tank ratios and kill ratios, but the fact is, my research today, there is a huge level of interest out there in the Germans and the tank aces. And where's it coming from? Is it a bad thing? That's a question I wonder. Is it a good thing? It doesn't matter how people get interested in World War II, as long as they can get interested in there. That's why I kind of want to let the conversation kind of go free fall now. So free stuff. So Paul, you're like me, you're not a gamer. But like me, you did grow up on the comics and things like that. And with your ledger tours, you work for a very well-known big company. You're bringing a lot of kind of middle-aged guys, aren't they?
Yes.
I can't think you have got even to the first service stations on the M25 before someone says, "Are we going to go and see Wittmann's grave and look at him?" It must happen every time. Where do you think it comes from? Why do you think these guys who book these tours, why is that something in their brain even before they get onto a ferry?
Well, it comes through various sources, I suppose, and one of it is many of these guys, and you're right. When we take a ledger tour, whether it be a Panzers in Normandy, a Tanks in Normandy tour, or our normal Normandy tours where we actually visit Le Camp, one of the first questions will be from people who want to visit the Merville Battery or want to visit Le Camp and see Wittmann's grave. A lot of it really just comes from, I believe, or internet forums, websites. Like you mentioned, Paul, if you stick Tiger in, It brings up dozens and dozens of websites. If you type in Tiger Wittmann, it brings up all these websites that are basically are almost part of the Wittmann myth. The shrines to Wittmann. A lot of them are incredibly inaccurate about what they've got on them, but I think that sparks the interest within the actual. People want to look at tigers, like you say, they're quite sexy. If they get involved in some of the well-known German history forums, Axis History, Feldbrau, some of the actual Panzer Archive, the German one, then obviously these discussions are going on and on and on, and have been probably. The earliest one I can remember probably goes back to around about the early 2000s, although I suspect the Wittmann and Tiger interest probably goes back to the discovery of his body, and maybe slightly earlier. Probably, like you say, from our era, Paul, from books, magazines, films. So it probably goes back to that slightly earlier area, but I think it's really took off since the discovery of his body and the evolution of the internet research forum. And
I mean,
what
worries me is
really interesting was Richard, because one of the, I'm an ex-tanker, I'm an ex-gunner. What I found really interesting, exactly what he said, because what came out in a lot of the interviews I actually did with German veterans were exactly what Richard said. And I'll refer back to Hans Ziegel again.
Yeah,
Ziegel, like I say, he started off in the Leibstandarte, initially on the mortars, but when they went into Russia, he was on the Sturmgeschütz and eventually became a battery commander. Then, during 1943, with the transfer of the cadre of officers and senior NTOs from Leibstandarte to Hitlerjugend, he took over one of the Panzer IV companies, the 8th Company of SS Panzer Regiment 12 that fought in Normandy. He was awarded the Knight's Cross during Operation Epsom. Basically, just around the Scher area, he was actually badly burned in some of his Knight's Cross actions. So wasn't there when his actual award citation was written up. And you'll actually see this across quite a lot of German veterans, where if they were wounded, somebody else has written the citation up. And that's where a lot of these inaccuracies seem to come in, because Ziegel is listed on a lot of the internet forums as having 37 tank kills. And I got to know him quite well. And when I actually asked him about that, he was like, well, no, where did that come? He actually laughed. Where did that come from? I said, oh, well, that's your citation for. And what it is actually what it says is that his company knocked out 37 tanks during the fighting around Scher in June 44, and he knocked out 16. So I obviously asked him, well, you were fighting the Sturmgeschütz in Russia from June 1941. You went all the way through the war in either Sturmgeschütz or Panzer IVs. How many tanks did you knock out? And what he said was, after he stopped laughing, is basically, I don't know. He said, it was a crew thing. And he says, I was more intent on stopping alive. And what he said was exactly what we should have said. And it's great to actually get the view of a experienced tank soldier, because I think the problem with a lot of the forums is that people don't understand what fighting in tanks is actually like. So they assume that it's quite easy to identify kills. But what he said was, he says, what he was actually notorious for kicking his driver all the time, and kicking other members of his crew, because he said, I wanted to stop alive. And he said, if my crew are worrying about whether we've killed somebody or we haven't, exactly what Richard said, he said, I'm moving on to the next target as commander. And what I don't want is my crew dawdling, wondering whether that's a kill or not. So very interesting to hear that. He made an interesting comment about Wittmann as well. What he said was, because he fought with Wittmann in the Sturmgeschützabteilung, and then obviously knew him in Russia and Normandy once he went into the Panzer Regiment. And he basically said that Wittmann was a good lone fighter. almost what you said before, Paul, about the Wittmann going into, it was almost like Villers-Bocage was a one-off, but it was created by Wittmann. That was almost his forte. He wasn't the great commander of tanks.
But he, for whatever reason, he has become the symbol, isn't he? I mean, on the YouTube comments again, I'm going to pick on Mark Prulks, who said something. He said, what did he say about Wittmann? He said, I can't go back, I can't find it now. Wittmann was so average and underrated, he's being sarcastic, that everyone in a 20k radius wanted credit for his kill. Only post-war, I would say. I mean, I've met Ken Tout, I met Joe Eakins, those guys. They didn't have any idea who Wittmann was on that day.
That's it.
Any idea?
No Allied tanker had, no Russian tanker, nobody knew who he was.
Exactly. So after war, Radley Walters, all these other guys, they all start, wanting to get involved in it, and they start learning post-war the story of Wittmann. Oh, well, I think I would have got him, and then the Typhoons start claiming it as well. And I was told by a French guide originally that it was the French resistance who got Wittmann. That was a new one to me. I thought, how did they do that again? It was just everybody wants to claim it. So and Nick Bard, who's watching, he's also saying that, of course, the German military, he's Mr. MG for you do, is set up with the personal awards. Look how many personal awards they have. The infantryman's clasp and the tank hunter. We don't have anything like that in the British and American. There's no award.
It's quite an interesting point, actually, when you actually look at the German awards themselves. The actual Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, and its higher grades, wasn't just a bravery award. It could be given for command, leadership. A good example is Jodl and Keitel were both awarded the Knight's Cross, and they never went near any front line for the entire Second World War. So in many ways, when I spoke to German veterans, and I think other people who interviewed them will bear out, some of the other awards that were actually amongst the troops were thought of as better awards, particularly the German Crossing Gold, because that was actually a combat award. It was an award where basically you generally, if you look at citations, and I'm sure there's people out there who've read Mark Erger's books on the German Cross and Gold, particularly in the SS divisions, there was always 4 or 5, even more, sometimes 7, 8 or 9 actions of personal leadership and valour in action before you got the German Cross and Gold, where the Knight's Cross could come down to literally one action. Then you had obviously the numbered Panzer assault badges. A lot of tank veterans thought that obviously if you could prove you'd been, and how they actually, a good question I saw asked not so long ago was, well, how did the Germans record tank kill claims? And the answer was there was no normal method. It was completely arbitrary. Whereas other awards, say for the close combat class, the tank assault badges, the numbered ones, they were actually, there was a system of recording those by the actual, what was known as the Verwaltungs section, the administration section of units. And that was placed in the Soul book. So there was a record of those close combat days, those tank assault days, whereas the Knight's Cross, basically there was no fast and set way of actually recording tank kills or particularly that increase in actual kills.
So let's reevaluate. So are we admitting that there's no reliable means of confirming tank kills accurately on the battlefield? That's one thing. We all agree on that. Yes. We also agree that the Germans have a much different to Allied system for counting and measuring, and some of the fanboys, I don't like that term, but I'm using it again, are measuring it by things like Knight's Crosses and awards that we don't have, and I say we as Allies don't have equivalent to measure against, in that how can you measure an Allied tanker when there isn't an award system in place to compare it? We're also basing it on tank against tank actions, which are incredibly rare. So in fact, we're basing all of this on really, really dodgy foundations, aren't we? Are we in agreement on that?
Yeah, basically.
I think part of the dodginess has to do with how much it varies, how much you have so many people, there's so many divisions, so many tankers, so many soldiers across this massive conflict, and to think that there's a standard method that was carried through the entire way, I think probably is when you look at your conclusions, you have to look at first what assumptions are you making, and if you're assuming that the way to record, say, tank kills, are they even recording tank kills at all? Was even an assumption that people were making when you look at what these veterans are saying when you go to ask them after the war. So how many did you kill? And they're like, shit, I don't know. Like, that wasn't what we were thinking with. Or I was the commander, and that's not what we didn't attribute that to commanders. You start to hear this after being like, wait a second, what? But your assumption that A, that they recorded them at all in that way, and B, that everybody across, say, like the Western Front would have done it the same way is also another assumption. So the dodginess has to do, I think people are assuming like a homogeneousness to that experience that was not so. And as soon as you start to hear from the actual people that were there, or you hear from interviews with historians who have had conversations with these people, you find that it is not so. And that kind of busts, like when you're looking at information, how are you collecting your data? I think that has to be looked at more often by people who are trying to find out about history. Where does the data come from and how are they collecting it? And then how you make up your mind based off of that data. You really have to do a lot more looking than just reading and sharing a Facebook post.
So let's be honest, Rich, that great point, Sophie, that Rich, dying in a tank is a shitty way to go, isn't it? I mean, tank warfare, the end in World War II is a horror. It's not a glamorous life, is it? I mean, 1 second you're alive, and the next second you're a burning inferno and things exploding inside the tank. Where's this mystique come from? Well, the question I want answering, I don't think we will answer it, but the question I want to have answers to is why frequently when I go to LACOM, I haven't been going this year because of COVID, are there flowers and trinkets and model tigers on Wittmann's grave? I'm not picking on Wittmann because any particular reason other than the fact that he is the guy who died down the road from where I live. It's not that I'm preferring him to Carius or Knispel or Bolt or any of those guys. He's done it. What possesses people to come to Normandy, go to a florist in Bayeux before their D-Day tour, before they go on in their camper van, and I know it's all national. We can't blame it on one nationality. It's British, American, everybody doing it. Why are they going to a grave with a little model tank and they're putting it on Wittmann's grave? What is going through their mind there? Because I'm going to say I find that really disgusting. I really, if you were going to go buy a bunch of flowers and put it on a nameless German, I take people to the German cemeteries. Of course, we all do, don't we, Paul? To get across the point of view that they're not all baddies. There's the innocent young kids. The SS is very different to the Kriegsmarine and But why would you want to put a bunch of flowers or trinket on Wittmann's grave? Where does that come from, Richard?
Have you asked them that?
Well, I've never seen anybody do it. I've never seen anybody.
I've never seen anybody do it, to be honest. But
yeah, you might want to ask them to see what is their reasoning, because again, this may vary.
I've never seen anybody doing it, but they're always there.
They're always there, aren't they? And they do change.
You don't have to search for Wittmann's grave because it's the most.
Just follow the flowers.
And the other thing, of course, is that there are plenty of other highly decorated German tank men buried in there.
That's true. And Luftwaffe Aces as well. Yeah, there's Luftwaffe guys. There's all.
His loader from Villers-Bocage is buried in there. Villerion, who was killed with him, killed in one of the other Tigers on the 8th of August, 44. He's buried in there. And I don't know, Paul, I struggle to explain the hero worship of that particular person, I must admit.
Richard, what's your thought on it? I mean, it must have come up in your conversations with World of Tanks and what have you. What's the...
Yeah, it's. I mean, as you can imagine, Paul, it's a heavy and a very deep subject, and a quite emotive subject, of course. Now, I can only say from a personal sort of standpoint, really, as a soldier, you've got a respect for your enemy. Okay, yes, you want to kill them, you want them dead, but you have a certain degree of respect for them. And I know, as far as the tanking fraternity is concerned, Wittmann was respected by the Allies. He was, I mean, there's two major questions to ask about all of this, of course. Was Wittmann a Nazi? Was he a war criminal? Well, the former, of course, that goes without saying. The latter, we could probably dedicate a whole show to discussing the whys and wherefores of it. So I can understand to a certain degree if these people you're talking about were veterans, because all the veterans, like you say, I interviewed David Arenda, sadly before he passed away, and I met these sort of people who, from a soldier's perspective, you would have thought there wasn't, I wouldn't say there was a degree of absolute hatred there. Yes, of course, they hated the enemy and they wanted the enemy dead. And we had this, this massive, this pure and extreme evilism. But we have to appreciate, of course, like, I was a soldier. Now, for the best will of God and just where I happened to be placed, I happened to be placed in the right army as far as I was concerned. It may well have been that I was in the wrong army. But I'd still want to do my best to support my country and fight for my country. And probably one of the biggest conflicts I was personally involved in was the last Gulf War. There was, we all know the implications of what was going on there, but did we have any contempt for the enemy we were facing? No. Did we treat them with respect when they were captured? Yes, absolutely. And we would expect the same, if it was the tables were turned. So you're right. It's almost an impossible question to answer about it. Part of my job, I've met an awful lot of collectors over the years at various levels, whether they're very wealthy people who collect tanks and all this sort of thing, all the way down to the lower collectors. Some of them, it's very interesting. Some of them are completely anti-Nazi artifacts, so they will not even entertain the idea of buying, I don't know, a swastika or something like this. However, some of them, it is what they live for, to search for these artifacts, which they will not discuss openly, and they hide away in little storerooms somewhere. So it's it's an interesting topic of conversation. I think a topic you could probably talk about. People will have very strong thoughts about it. Yeah, but it's
there's that fact, isn't it, that when Hitler's artwork comes up for sale, his paintings, which actually aren't as terrible as you think they were going to be. He's a terrible human being, of course, but his paintings aren't awful. I mean, they're not. But when they come up for sale, and they do, they are mostly, so it seems, bought in New York by Jewish collectors. And you could go into the psychology of that, owning something that the guy who'd killed your people. I mean, that's another whole big subject to go into, but I can understand that more easily than I can understand putting a trinket on Wittmann's grave. That's the thing that I find.
Well, I suppose as a tank soldier, I mean, forget everything else. As an individual, Wittmann was a bloody good tank commander. That's the appreciation from my perspective.
I think you're right.
And that's where it ends.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I would actually go and lay flowers on his grave, because that's not something, but I can appreciate the man from a soldier's perspective, from the tactician, and the ability he had to command, an armored vehicle during an incredibly difficult period.
Yeah, I mean, a Western value to appreciate and admire competence in a single individual. I mean, you see that reflected everywhere. And we're always interested in the CEOs, we're interested in the musicians and the top athletes and stuff like that. And I think people identify through that admiration with those figures. Again, I'm not a person that would lay flowers on Wittmann's grave either. And I think it would be interesting to get a German's perspective here, because we're all I'm American.
Yeah, I did.
Y'all from Blighty. That would be really interesting to kind of hear that perspective. But I can only speak from mine. But I mean, we celebrate both individual and team accomplishments in individuals as a culture. And so taking all of the, like, was he a Nazi? Was he a war criminal? What's the right way to think about it? What's the right way to feel about it? Kind of looking at how speaking of the mental mechanics of how people end up with Michael Wittmann profile pictures and flowers on his grave. I would just, my base assumption is that they assume a competence in the guy that they can read about. Obviously this kill count thing and all of that, like you can get in the weeds about all the historical details, and that's kind of a fun journey in and of itself. But when a person who just digs history sees that, they see competence and they're like, sweet, and maybe and again, I can't speak for anybody directly, and I think it would be like, let's get a Wittmann fanboy and let's hear what he has to say about why he thinks that Michael Wittmann was the shit and why he goes there every year and steals his grave marker. Like, I kind of but why? But there's people that do that with modern celebrities as well.
Because there's another angle to it. What sort of person would steal his grave?
Yeah. But you have people that do that to celebrities too. They want to buy their clippings of their hair and shit. You see an obsession,
exactly.
And so it's just another sort of read of that.
Fanboy watching this who wants to come on and defend his position or her position. Let's not be sexist about it.
Yeah, it's
on the one hand, it's weird because we don't we as historians don't read enough about the German side when it comes to World War II generally. I mean, there's Niels Henkemann, who's writing a book about the Germans in the Cotentin, and he's a Dutchman doing it because basically no one else was. He started being interested in the 101st and what have you, and the 82nd in the Utah Beach area, then realized there was so little information about the Germans. He's basically writing a book, and he's doing a 2-volume study on the Germans in Normandy, which will be brilliant. And there's Nick Budd, who's watching this, who's trying to, get across and beat some of the myths about the MG42. But those people are in the absolute minority. Most of the tour guides, this is perhaps a generalization, they read books, they read the James Hollands and the Peter Gaddick Adams and the Stephen Ambrose and the Max Hastings, and they don't read very much about the German side of things. So weirdly, with the Tank Aces, at least we're reading about the German side, but the net result somehow is that they're being hero worshipped. And I don't... That's the thing that I would like to get my head around.
It's a strange thing. Oh, sorry.
With regards to hero worship, like you mentioned with Mr. Cutland said, you're out there, you think that, God has placed you on the right side and you're doing the right thing for your country. I think it would be fair to assume that perhaps those boys think the same.
I think in some ways, Paul, it's like you just identify. I mean, I was quite fortunate in, and like I say, I'm not going to bore everyone with the story of how it happened, but how I got involved with German veterans. But when I started tour guiding sort of nearly 20 years ago, what I realised early on was that to broaden my knowledge and actually, because I think you've got to understand battles from both sides. If you only understand it from one side, you're going to have a very limited view of what actually took place. So, I was probably more fortunate than most. I began to actually study from early days when my German was extremely dodgy, but I had some very good friends. And luckily, quite a few German veterans I met spoke English. But I began to study the German side of battles in much greater extent. I mean, that would look down to me interested in the Eastern Front as well. But I think now, as German combat histories and personal memoirs have come more into the English language, the resources are now there for not just tour guides, but the general military historian or military buff to actually look at the both sides of the battles. And certainly, I've got some good friends in Russia, Russian historians, and there's a lot more available coming on stream from the Russian archives as well. And but it is, yes, I think it's a way. In the past, I think it's been a way of actually people connecting with the German side in a relatively limited type of way.
Let's look at it with you have the German side of things. I'm like, okay, Michael Wittmann, he's SS. I don't like Nazis, all of this, but let's take a look at, because there are Allied fanboys too. Look at General Patton and the people that really identify with him. But every single person that's ever lived on planet Earth is multifaceted. There's depth, there's nuance, there's difference. Just because somebody did something in war competently doesn't mean that was all there is to their personality. Look at Patton. You can read his own writings. He's kind of an admitted racist. He's anti-Semitic. You can read that in his own words. I think that people should read more and try to read more from these people in their own words if they are identifying with these people. Understand the facets, understand the nuance. But the German soldier wore a different uniform, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to paint them as all sort of homogeneously, well, this is evil, all these were monsters, because obviously you look at, there's war crimes on the Allied side as well. It's nuanced, it's complex. There's every single person is their own person, and finding out about those people and their stories, well, isn't that part of what history is all about in the first place? I can't say it's right or wrong to hold Wittmann as a hero. I don't know very much about him because I don't really care that much, and I'm kind of a hipster, so if something is popular, I kind of have to intentionally avoid it. I don't know. But so I've never really looked into this gentleman with regards to how he acted and what he thought and how he felt about things that I could compare to my own outlook, right? All I know is his military service. And I think that's all people really are looking for. But you see sort of this blind hero worship again of athletes. Look at anybody, like Messi or, LeBron or Michael Jordan. People see their achievements and then what they say on the outside. There's no social media back then. You can't see any of Michael Wittmann's spicy Twitter posts. There's no way to see how he interacted on a day-to-day basis until you really start looking and start interviewing people and stuff like that. I know you mentioned speaking with his widow. provides
I'm not
that provides a
necessarily gonna
window.
do that
but-
story. Well, I kind of will hint at it. I did meet his widow a number of years ago, and I'm in for a penny, in for a pound. And her first line to me was, "And your racial background is."
Yes.
And that was literally the first thing she asked me.
Mrs. Wittmann.
Sorry?
I feel still a committed Nazi as Frau Wittmann.
Well, I'm glad you said it, because I mean, it was fairly obvious that
it's
she
the truth.
was pretty much a card-carrying, if there is such a thing, member. It was fascinating spending the time with her. Awful at the same time, but fascinating. But so I think, because somebody was mentioned on YouTube earlier, we don't know much about Wittmann. Well, we kind of do know he was a Nazi, and if his widow's anything to go by, she was as well. And
and Mr. and Mrs. Truman wouldn't let Jews in their house.
I think it's fair to say he was committed to the cause.
Yeah, committed to the cause.
But I think, as Richard pointed out, I mean, one of the things and because interviewing some of these guys over the years, it's sort of, I felt like there was a bit of a conflict in myself because of, I mean, yes, probably some of them were still Nazis. So there's a bit of conflict there, but what Richard was saying, I think once the soldier in you comes out and the historian comes out, that you're actually thinking, well, okay, let's put this political thing aside and let's look at their actions as a soldier. I mean, I never interviewed anybody that I knew had committed any war crimes, but Richard makes a very valid point that at the end of the day, going away from the kill count and the Panzer Ace and the Tiger Ace and what have you, there was a lot of very brave, highly skilled soldiers who earned some very high decorations. Now, whether they earned them for the right reasons or not is sometimes in debate. I mean, there's a couple of good comparisons that sort of throw in. The one veteran I interviewed was a Sturmgeschütz veteran, Heinrich Engel, from Sturmgeschütz Brigade 259. He won the Knight's Cross in 1943 for knocking out 16 Soviet tanks, T-34s, in a single engagement. But what Engel said was that basically when he radioed in, obviously, the success of the defensive mission that he'd been on, his commander asked if there was any witnesses. So I'm going just to go back slightly to the arbitrary way in which kills were recorded or not recorded. So he was awarded a Knight's Cross because he actually had 3 infantrymen from the 3rd Gebirge Division with him who actually witnessed. So they were his witnesses. Then you go to looking at another one in Normandy, Ernst Bachmann. Bachmann's Knight's Cross was awarded for, I think, Paul, it was knocking out 15, 16 Shermans around La Laurier during Operation Cobra.
Sounds about right to me. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to cover it on the Ledger Panzers in Normandy. To be honest, the location where it happened is just too dangerous to take people. It's a very dangerous location on a very fast road. But his action is right. It was like to say that he knocked these 16 Germans out, and basically in a defensive action, going through the whole thing, trying to get back to his own lines because elements of the Das Reich division were cut off by the American advancing forces from Cobra. Subsequent research, and I've got to say, within the historical community online, there are some absolutely fantastic researchers, way better than some of our extremely well-known historians. But I don't know whether don't know whether I should go into that. I mean, certain book that was written in 2014 by one of the premier British historians. If you read the section on Villers-Bocage, it's absolutely shocking. It basically is a regurgitation of Gary Simpson's atrocious on Wittmann, which is,
I know who you mean.
verbatim conversations in the turret. I'm not quite sure how he got that information. And there's the Bartman, which proved that the only elements in that area were elements of the 3rd Armoured Division, 4th Armoured Division, or 1st Infantry Division, together with the 745th Independent Tank Battalion, none of which could be proved to be in that exact area, and none of which had any losses that were anywhere related to what Batman's account was. But Batman's awarded the Knight's Cross. So basically, we had one guy who had to have witnesses to get his Knight's Cross, and one guy who returned to his own lines, said, I've knocked out 16 Germans to get here, and they awarded him the Knight's Cross. No witness stand has been proved. It's, you know, it was an exaggeration, or was he confused by the situation, etc. Well, only Batman can, or could have answered that question. But again, the problem is, if you go on YouTube, there's a certain well-known historian, well, relatively well-known historian who has an edition of his of what he does on YouTube, and all that does is regurgitate the Batman myth with obviously no research. So the answer is out there regarding Batman's engagement for his Knight's Cross, that clearly it didn't happen the way that he said it happened, and yet these things get regurgitated. But yeah, bottom line is that, you know, I mean, these guys, a lot of them saw a lot of combat. They're obviously highly skilled at what they did, very brave men, whatever cause they were actually fighting for.
Exactly, very brave men, no matter what the cause is. The human experience, I think,
we've come full circle in a sense, in that we're admitting that the information is out there for people who want to know this stuff properly. There are serious studies, and lots of people have been looking at these things very, very accurately and sincerely, and ignoring the previous myths and legends. So that there is hope that some of the fanboys will progress from being fanboys to historians. But before we kind of wrap things up, I want to bring in Sophie and Rich a little bit about, because at the end, the bit me and Paul are interested in is the whole, how does the historical interpretation, how does historiography affect the gaming community? Do you lead? Do you let history lead you? Do you let the gamers lead you? How do you push forward in terms of the development of new games and tactics? And what drives what? I'll bring you and Richard, because you're the professional.
Interestingly, before we go to that, I just want to go back to one point. It's interesting what you say about historians, because I can't remember who wrote it, but I've just read a book about Wittmann a few weeks ago, which was completely that he was a party man. In fact, he came a year late to join the party. He was almost sort of like forced into it. He was a professional soldier. But it just shows you that many people's, you know, whether it's the truth, whether it's not the truth, whether it's an embellishment of the truth or not, how people differ in their views on it. But this whole book was very adamant that he was a professional soldier who was never had ideology about the Nazi party or anything. But of course, he was forced into it. But quite right, like you said, you can pick up another book which is completely opposite. But it just shows how
that's the problem.
Yeah, it just shows
curious as well with regards to how does history drive World of Tanks' vision and development for their game? How much of historical accuracy and historical representation do the developers try to use, lead, and then what is, with regards to historical representation, the marketing stance of World of Tanks, and how has that changed over the years, if at all?
Yeah, definitely. Go for it, Richard.
So, as obviously Sophie knows all too well, so we're going back to World of Tanks is a desktop fun quick game. It's the celebration of the armored vehicles. It deliberately, for many reasons, doesn't get involved in the people aspect of it. There is violence, of course, but it's all implied violence. It's tank on tank action, etc., etc. As far as it would probably take about an hour to explain the whole development process, but in essence, it's you get various tech trees from various nations. They look at the way that they can fit the different types of tank into these, what they call tech trees, starting from the very basics of a vehicle, for example, like your Panzer Is, etc., all the way up to, and don't forget, this is a game that sort of stops, Cold War era. So, for the British line, we stop around just before Chieftain, unfortunately, because everybody would love to have a Chieftain in game, but we stop about then. So it's all about the technical aspects of it. And when the development side of it is working, I say it's easy. It's not easy at all. It's relatively easy to research a vehicle, which was an active service, which you have physical access to, which you can go to a museum. You can spend, we're actually on the stage now of taking 3D prints of vehicles to see exactly how we can render them and create them digitally in game. It used to be, not so long ago, we'd spend about 2 weeks measuring every part of this vehicle and trying to get it exactly right. But that's fine for that. You've got blueprints, you've got all of the access to that. And then it goes over to the very, very clever folks at the development team who probably the semi-easier part of it is creating it visually in game, and they've always prided themselves on historical accuracy as far as the visual is concerned.
Okay.
Don't forget, this is a game, like Sophie said at the end of the day. Now, what you can have in any game, there's this critical term which people hate called balancing, and what that means is that you cannot have one tank which is up there as term of its capabilities. So maybe it's superior in speed to everything else. It destroys everything much easier. Because of course, from a gaming perspective, everybody's going to play this one tank and it would just be pointless to have anything else. So there is an attempt to balance it across, to have an almost level playing field, different tiers of vehicles. I forgot what your question was now, Paul, but anyway.
This is all good anyway. That's fine.
But that's the development side of it. But again, it's all about the vehicles. And very earlier on, the CEO, Victor Kisley, has always been an absolute nut as far as history is concerned. And don't forget, this was a Belarusian-based game. So, of course, across there, you have to appreciate that the tank across there is very much like, I was trying to think of a comparison for the Brits, probably, I don't know, a lager or something.
Pop knobs.
Pop knobs, perfect, thank you. Or a cup of tea, there you go. But very, very popular. And he was always adamant from day one that it was going to be all about the vehicles and the capability of the vehicles as opposed to people. Because obviously from any game, and I'm not going to mention other games, but you could cross that very sticky boundary into the almost gratuitous violence and things which people complain about, stuff that I wouldn't let my young children play and all that sort of thing as well. And on top of all of that, we were very, very keen to make it as realistic as possible from the point of view of sound effects, something as minor of that. We go out to, I spent almost 2 weeks in Jordan recording engines on tanks and things, just so you can make that level of it realistic. But quite absolutely 100% agree with Sophie, it's not a simulator. Now, I've had a lot of years on simulators. Simulators are boring. There is nobody would pay good money or invest their time to play on a tank simulator because it is dull and monotonous. If you want a game, you want to be able to play, it's fun. I suppose for me, the whole game is there are probably two things which you could sort of put in some comparison to real tank warfare. Teamwork helps. You know, if you work as a team, you have got a better chance of winning. I know Sophie said about you can be incredibly individual, but if you work together as a team, there is a better chance of winning. And positioning, much like a real tank, the better positioning you take, you know, try and avoid the sides to the enemy, keep the frontal armor towards the enemy, you have more chance of surviving. That is where the sort of similarities start and end as far as real tank warfare is concerned. It's a fun game and people get passionate about their particular vehicles. But like you were saying, even in the game, you know, what's the most popular tanks in the game, Sophie? I'd say predominantly German. To a massive...
popular by what? Like you'd have to look at sales numbers, I think, in games played, and I don't have access to that data. Of course, you might.
I do, but I can't say, obviously.
Of course. So what's the most sold premium in World of Tanks? Could you say?
Well, I mean, let's take a prime example. Tiger 131 is an incredibly popular.
Is that the most sold premium?
That is an incredibly popular premium vehicle.
Okay, sure. But you can't answer that, which is totally fine. That's proprietary. That's your company's business. You know what I mean? But with regards to popularity, there's more than one thing in World of Tanks besides the historical representation, which drives sales, of course. So you have 131, which is that's a tank that we can still see it, we can still hear it, right? Yeah. But there's obviously tanks in World of Tanks that are not represented at all by physical examples or even by any historical basis of existence at all. And so you have to, it's not wholly historical either. But when it comes down to popularity of tanks, I have only my perspective as a North American region representative of the game. I do have a lot of EU-based people and what they say and what I observe at the times of day that I play the game to try to draw my conclusions. And of course, that's as good as any wild guess. I could throw a dart at a board of tanks and come up with an answer, but what we would need is the sales numbers and the games count of each vehicle in game to make some sort of statement about that. But if that's not something that you share, totally understand. Just saying, I'm not going to make a statement about what's popular or not in the game because I'd rather have the numbers.
German vehicles are popular. I mean, from a very loose perspective, German vehicles are popular in game, and you also, interestingly enough, in game, you see a certain degree of national pride as well. certainly.
But yeah, as well, the TOG 2 is very popular.
Yeah, exactly. The TOG 2 has become almost a legendary vehicle, thanks to other people as well in game. You know, us Brits, although they may not be the best vehicles in game, we do actually quite enjoy playing the British tanks in game. So there is a certain degree of that. But I've absolutely completely forgotten what your question was in the first place.
I have as well. But I mean, the interesting thing is that I don't think we're going to conclude anything in an hour and a half long, you know, video discussion, but it is fascinating, and I think that I would like there to be more cooperation between all these media. I think that's one of the things that I think would be better changing, is that I know historians, I can name friends of mine who say I wouldn't even possibly get involved in video gaming. You know, if they asked me, I would say no. And I go, well, that's not the way to look at it, is it? Because all of these things, movies, video games, TV commercials, comics, if they all talk about World War II, they are all relevant. They are all helping or hindering to educate people about what went on in the World War II. And if they all work together, if people cross over more, there has to be something better, and we can maybe avoid having this fan worship. And I liked your point earlier, Paul, when you said that when you were interviewing German veterans, I've interviewed not as many as you have, but the odd one here or there. And I did interview one who I believe was involved in a bit of a mass murder, a couple of 101st Airborne guys. And as soon as I mentioned that, he clammed up immediately, and he suddenly changed the location he'd been at for the previous half an hour interview. Oh, no, I wasn't there. And he changed himself to 3 miles down the road. But the fact you said that you were wary about, you know, being interested in the German side proves you've got a conscience. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that the people who emblazon their Facebook pages with the pictures of Michael Wittmann with a Knight's Cross or whatever, I don't think they're making that mental process. That's what I think is interesting. Why are they only able to see the prowess of a tank commander without any unease about what he represented? I think and it comes back to the flowers on the grave thing again. I'm all for understanding who Wittmann is. I'm all for understanding he was pretty good at his job, didn't do so well on August the 8th near Caen, but generally he was pretty good at his job. But it's this turning it into an obsession, which was the whole point of this show. That's when it gets worrying. And maybe, just maybe, there's one or two people watching this today, or will watch it later, and I might try and publicize it a bit if I think it was all right, which I think was all right. Who will look at themselves and think, actually, maybe I will start reading about the Allied commanders a bit more. Maybe I'll back off a bit. And if that's the case, I'll feel we've done some good here. I
think you're right, Paul. You've got to put it in perspective. And to be honest, when I'm doing the ledger, the Panzers tour in Normandy, when we've discussed Villers-Bocage and obviously been into the town, and then up to point 213. What I always say is, and I'll do the same for the Wittmann Hill site. I mean, we haven't got time to get into that debate, but I have my own thoughts on that. And what I do actually, I investigate. I put to people. My former profession was obviously in the police, so I'll say, right, okay, so let's present the actual evidence, not the myths, not the innuendo, not the smoke and mirrors. What is the actual evidence? And that leads generally to a consensus on the conclusion, but we haven't got time.
Well, we can do it another show if you want to.
But what I always end in both those two sites, Paul, is I talk about Major Peter Scott, commanding A Squadron of the Sharpshooters, who died at point 213, and I show them photos of a guy called John Such and Ernie Wellbelow, and talk about the 12 members of the Northants Yeomanry that were killed on the 8th of August 1944. Because obviously most of our visitors are British with the smattering occasionally of Americans, but to put it into perspective, and just remember that the guys we're discussing were fighting. They were the enemy. They were fighting on the wrong side. Perhaps sometimes we should actually remember the guys who were fighting on the right side as well.
Well, I think that is pretty much. We'll bring it. We'll end it at that, because that's just to me a perfect way to sum everything up. And you remember that that there were heroes on both sides, and it's a much more nuanced subject than we perhaps give it credit for. So I think that's a
very much so.
wonderful way to end it really. And yeah, no, I've been monitoring the things on the YouTube, and I think it's been I don't think we've come to any conclusions as such, but I think it's been interesting, and I definitely think there's value in doing something as a future to this. I mean, the reason this show came about for those watching is I was wanting to do something about Operation Totalize, which I did. And when I announced my Operation Totalize show, where Mike Bechtel joined me and Sean Claxton joined me, talked about various things. We talked about the 49th Division, the 51st Highland Division. We talked about the Poles a little bit as well. But when I posted it or tweeted it, I literally counted, and I within a minute, someone has said, "Are you going to discuss Wittmann's death?" I mean, and I hadn't mentioned it. I said, "I'm going to do an Operation Totalize show." And Operation Totalize was a fucking big operation. It's not one of the biggest in Normandy, but it was a big one, you know. And literally within a minute of me tweeting, "I go do Wittmann's death," and I thought that's exactly what I want to kind of counter. That there's a lot more to combat than just Wittmann. There's a lot more than counting tank cases, getting to understand the misery of being a tank crewman. Is something we can touch on in a future show. So brilliant. I've enjoyed that. But they're now talking about the Norm Christie show about Wittmann, and we can do that in a future presentation. I mean, just my
I don't mind when we got time, Paul. I don't mind discussing that because
we'll do. I mean, I always say the problem with the Wittmann thing.
Mirrors, that's what I was talking about.
The problem with the Wittmann thing, I think, is that we're always dealing with a contaminated crime scene. That's the problem. Yes. All the things, the photos we've got, the aerial photos. Yeah. If we had one taken 3 minutes after battle, we'd be able to make some better judgments than we can looking at photos that were taken weeks, months, when some of them even a year later, because everything by then has changed. And you know, you're not going onto a crime scene that has been anyway. That's another show. We can do that something else. But anyway, Nick Budd is saying we should evaluate German military culture as a topic as well, which I think is worth discussing. And anyway,
well, I think there's more to discuss about, you know, to bring in. I mean, there are things I'm not trying to mention about obviously the German High Command and their assessment of tank kills, which is worth people out there actually doing a little bit of research on. If they haven't already, some people will know about that. But
well, I think the point is people seem to have liked it, and we can always go back and elaborate on things if you three are happy to come back on other shows, either together or individually or with other people, whatever. I very much appreciate your input, and so I think we'll round it all up because we've done an hour. I said we'd be less than an hour and a half. It's 91 minutes, so there we go. It's talking about tanks. We can all talk about tanks. So a bit of housekeeping in terms of those watching it. If you haven't click subscribe, click the little bell to get the notifications. Check out my Patreon pages. Check out the links of Paul Errington works for Ledger. Check out him. Sophie's got loads of email of YouTube and gaming and internet presence. You can find all about her, and Richard's, of course, doing lots of stuff. So I've enjoyed what we've discussed tonight. So any final comments from any of you before we go? Sophie, any final words?
Something stuck with me very early at the beginning, and you said that historians don't have a voice compared to film and media. And I think that's something that you underestimate yourselves on. Like learning social media and teaching through social media, you can reach all these people, these millions and millions of people playing games and watching films, and reach them and teach them. Because I think like shows like this are fantastic, and reach people and kind of do a bit of myth busting or listen to what they have to say and show them more and teach what you know. There's so much potential, and my generation is grateful for it when you do. So
we are trying. I mean, alas, we're only in hundreds of viewers at the moment. I'm hoping, I keep saying one day one of these shows is going to go viral, and I hope it will. But, you know, there are YouTube videos about, you know, people just playing Call of Duty that get seen by millions. So I think we'll get there in the end. But Richard, any final comments? And would you come back and do some future stuff with us as well?
Yeah, I'd love to, Paul. I mean, thank you for all three of you for what you do. As far as we're all concerned, I mean, we're all ultimately at the end of the day, we all love the tanks.
We do.
You know, forget about everything else, and that's my passion. Always had been. I feel very guilty now. Firstly, because I didn't realise Paul, of course, was a policeman. I'm thinking about my MOT. Is it out of date? But also because I noticed I've got. I've got a Tiger One up there as well. I've just thought, it's terrible. He's going to think I'm such a fanboy now, isn't he? So,
well, yeah, I've just noticed that. Yeah,
hands are four next to my desk.
Yeah, well,
yeah, I saw that earlier. Yeah, I wasn't going to comment.
But thank you, Paul. Thank you for everything you do.
Well, thank you. Because Sophie, your first tank you ever got was a Panzer IV, your first model tank, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was 8 years old, a little die-cast one. That's right.
Mine was a Humber heavy armored car was my first.
Cool.
That's kind of cool.
Mine was
any final words, Paul?
Mine was a Tiger 1.
See, there you are then, you know. Hoist by your own petard there. Well, anyway, it's been good.
Remember,
So,
Paul, like one of those first sort of remote control things.
Nice, yeah.
1/35th scale, yeah. Yeah, I think I got it for Christmas. It was, I thought it was the bee's knees. I've enjoyed it. I think there's a lot of other, other areas we can go into. Not
definitely
on this subject, but a lot of other subjects. But I mean, it's. I've got to say, and I just say again, that there's a lot of extremely good researchers out there who have busted a lot of myths and brought the history forward. So anybody who's listening, it is worth actually not necessarily taking some of these websites that you'll see as face value, and to be fair, some of the books as face value. There's a lot of good research.
And a lot of the YouTube videos. I mean, I watched about 10 Michael Wittmann shows on YouTube today, and I think 8 were just shit and 2 were quite good, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, and I say shows, they were just kind of whatever they were, fan worship stuff. But anyway, we've come to an end. So thank you very much for those watching. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Paul. I've enjoyed it. So I'll end the stream and we'll see you all again. Next show I've got definitely coming is September the 11th. We're talking about the first footsteps into Holland, the American 30th Division arriving into Noorbeek. I've got shows. I've just been planning today. I've got shows coming up with Alex Kershaw about the Bedford Boys on Dog Green and Omaha. Shows with Ben Main, who's watching, about Gold Beach. I got a show.
Hi, Ben.
Arkham coming up. I got a show. What else have I got coming up? Another one. Oh, John McManus. We're going to look at some more stuff on Omaha. Sword Beach. So there's lots of things coming up. Going to go back and return to some D-Day subjects. So brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to end the stream, and I'm Paul Woodad saying thank you for watching World War II TV, and just don't forget to click subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.
Take care, everybody.
Right. So the stream is ended now, and it just